She had lived in this house for 11 years. She had watched sunrises from its balconies, hosted dinners in its grand hall, and raised children in its corridors. And yet every morning, before anyone else woke up, she was on her knees. What he didn't know, what she didn't know, was that the truth was already waiting. And when it finally surfaced, it would change everything. Stay with me. Because nothing in this story is what it first appears to be. There are 3 things I want you to hold in your mind as this story unfolds. First, who actually owned this mansion? Second, why did she stay? And third, what was the truth he had been hiding, and for how long? Because by the time we reach the end of this story, every single answer is going to feel like the ground shifting beneath your feet. And before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Eleanor Voss. And if you had met Eleanor in 1998, you would have found a woman who was, by every measure, extraordinary. She was 31 years old, sharp-eyed and possessed of a kind of quiet authority that people noticed the moment she walked into a room. She hadn't inherited that quality. She'd had built it year by year, sitting at the right hand of her father, Robert Voss, one of the most formidable real estate developers in the history of the American Southwest. Robert Voss was not a man who believed in luck. He believed in leverage. He believed in patience. And he believed, above all else, in the compounding power of an asset held long enough, understood deeply enough, and never surrendered without a fight. He passed every one of those beliefs to Eleanor. Robert had started with nothing. He grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the son of a Mexican-American bricklayer who worked 6 days a week and still couldn't make rent in January. Robert watched his father come home with cracked hands and a quiet dignity that never bent, and he made a decision at 14 years old that the only way to honor that dignity was to build something that couldn't be taken. He got his real estate license at 19. He bought his first duplex at 22. By 30, he owned 47 properties across 3 states. By 50, he had constructed the kind of portfolio that made other developers study his moves like scripture. The Voss name became synonymous with permanence, with solidity, with the kind of wealth that didn't flash, it simply endured. Eleanor was an only child. Her mother, Catherine, had died of breast cancer when Eleanor was 9 years old. And from that point forward, Robert Voss raised his daughter the way he built his buildings, with precision, with intention, and with an almost religious commitment to teaching her that the world would not make space for her unless she understood it better than anyone else. In the room, Eleanor learned to read a balance sheet before she learned to drive. She was in board meetings by 16. She graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in finance and returned immediately to the Voss organization, where she worked 12-hour days not to prove herself to her father, but because she genuinely loved it. She loved the architecture of a deal. She loved the geometry of a negotiation, and she loved more than anything the thing her father had taught her to love above all else: the land itself, the permanence of it, the way it outlasted everything. By the time Robert Voss died of a heart attack in November 2003, Eleanor was 36 years old, and she had already been running the day-to-day operations of the company for nearly 4 years. The inheritance was, by any standard, staggering. The primary asset was the estate, a 29,000-square-foot property outside Scottsdale, Arizona, built on 63 acres of high desert land that Robert had purchased in 1979, for what would today seem like an almost comical sum. By 2003, the estate alone was valued at close to $90 million. The broader portfolio, commercial properties, development rights, land holdings across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, totaled conservatively just over $1 billion. Eleanor Voss was, at 36, one of the wealthiest women in the American Southwest. And she was, in almost every way that mattered, completely alone. That is the detail that changes everything. That is the crack in the foundation that a very particular kind of man knows how to find, and knows how to widen, slowly without anyone noticing, until the whole structure has shifted and the woman standing inside it no longer recognizes the walls around her. His name was Raymond Hale. And Raymond Hale was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who encountered him during that period, one of the most naturally compelling human beings they had ever met. He was 41 years old when he met Eleanor. He was tall, well-dressed in the deliberate way of a man who has studied what well-dressed looks like on someone with money, and he had the particular gift of making whoever he was talking to feel as though they were the only person in the world worth talking to. He had grown up in Phoenix, the product of a middle-class family that had scraped through his childhood, with a series of small businesses that never quite landed. He had never lacked for confidence. He had simply, for most of his adult life, lacked for opportunity. And he had learned, in the long years of watching people with more than him, exactly what opportunity looked like when it arrived. They met at a charity gala in Scottsdale in the spring of 2004. 5 months after Robert Voss had been buried, Eleanor had come to the event because her father's name was on the donor wall, and she felt it was the right thing to do. She was not there to be charmed. She was not there to meet anyone. She had spent the previous 5 months submerged in grief and legal paperwork and the overwhelming administrative weight of assuming full control of the Voss portfolio, and the last thing she was looking for was a conversation with a stranger. But Raymond Hale had a gift for finding the last thing a person was looking for and making it feel inevitable. He didn't come in with flattery. That was the thing people who later tried to explain him always came back to. He didn't lead with compliments, didn't try to impress her with what he knew or what he'd done. He asked her a question about the land, about the desert, about what it felt like to own something that had existed for millions of years before you arrived, and would exist for millions of years after you were gone. And Eleanor, who had spent her entire life surrounded by people who talked about land in terms of yield and return and square footage, looked at this man across a charity gala table and felt, for the first time since her father died, like someone was speaking her language. They dated for 18 months. In that time, Raymond was, by every account Eleanor would later give, almost flawlessly present. He listened. He remembered. He showed up. When she was overwhelmed by a difficult negotiation, he would sit with her at the kitchen table for hours, not offering solutions, just being there in the way that someone who is trying to earn your trust knows exactly how to be there. He met her attorney, her accountant, the handful of close colleagues who formed the narrow perimeter of her professional world. He was gracious with all of them. He was careful. And Eleanor, who had built her entire life around the ability to read a situation, who had inherited her father's instinct for knowing when something didn't add up. Eleanor trusted him completely. He moved into the estate in October 2005. It happened gradually, the way these things always do. A few nights here, a drawer there, until it was simply easier for him to have a key, and then simply natural for him to be there full time. Eleanor told the people closest to her that it felt right. That the house, which had felt cavernous and silent since her father's death, felt inhabited again. Raymond, for his part, moved through the estate with a quiet ease that struck some of Eleanor's staff as unusual. The way a man settles into a space he already feels he owns rather than a space he has been invited into. But no one said anything. Eleanor seemed happy. And happiness, in a woman who had been so visibly carrying grief, was a thing the people around her were reluctant to question. The first change was so small that Eleanor would later struggle to identify exactly when it had happened. Her longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Park, who had handled Voss family legal affairs for over 2 decades, and was perhaps the person alive who understood the portfolio most intimately, suddenly became, in Raymond's framing, a liability. It wasn't a direct accusation. Raymond was never direct about these things, which was precisely what made him so effective. It was a pattern of small suggestions, small questions, small moments of doubt that he planted, and then watered patiently over weeks and months. Had she noticed the way Gerald always seemed to steer conversations toward fees? Had she looked closely at the billing on the estate transfers last quarter? Wasn't it interesting that Gerald had bought a vacation house in Sedona, the same year the Voss portfolio had its biggest restructuring? None of it was true. All of it was enough. By the summer of 2006, Gerald Park had been replaced. The new attorney, a man named Davis Croft, who Raymond had introduced as an old colleague from his business dealings, was, on paper, impeccably credentialed. In practice, Davis Croft was the second instrument in a plan that had been in motion far longer than Eleanor knew. Because the thing about Raymond Hale, the thing that would only become clear much later, when investigators began pulling at the threads, was that he had not arrived at that charity gala by accident. He had been there because someone had told him to be there, and that someone had been watching Eleanor Voss for over a year. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before the truth surfaces, you need to understand what Eleanor's daily life looked like in the years when the trap was being tightened. And that is the part of this story that is the hardest to hear, not because it is violent or dramatic, but because it is so quiet, so ordinary, so easy to miss. The scrubbing began in 2007. Raymond had introduced it with characteristic patience and framing, as a grounding exercise. He had read about it somewhere, he said. Some therapeutic approach involving physical labor and mindfulness, the idea being that repetitive manual work could calm an overactive mind, reduce anxiety, restore a sense of control. Eleanor had, by that point, been subtly repositioned in her own life as a woman with anxiety. A woman who was brilliant but fragile, capable but prone to overwhelm, in need of structure and support. That repositioning had taken Raymond approximately 2 years. It had been done without a single raised voice. So when he suggested the morning scrubbing, just the main hall, just the marble floors, just as a routine, just to start the day with something grounding, Eleanor had accepted it. And then it had expanded. And then it had become expectation. And then, somewhere in the years that followed, it had become simply what she did, before anyone else woke up. On her knees, in her own house, Eleanor Voss, whose father had built one of the great real estate empires of the American Southwest, scrubbing the floors of the estate that bore his name, while the man who had told her it was good for her slept in the bedroom above. By 2009, Raymond had taken operational control of the household finances. By 2010 he had, with Davis Croft's legal assistance, positioned himself with broad power of attorney over several of the estate's subsidiary holdings. Signed, Eleanor would later discover, during a period when she was recovering from a minor surgical procedure and had been administered sedatives. By 2011, the first shell company had been registered in the Cayman Islands, in the name of a trust that Eleanor had never heard of, attached to a set of assets she believed were still held directly in the Voss family name. Raymond hadn't stolen from her in one dramatic move. He had moved money the way water moves through rock, not by force but by persistence, by finding the path of least resistance and flowing through it, again and again, until the stone itself changes shape. The morning that changed everything was a Tuesday in March of 2012. Eleanor was in the main hall at 6:04 in the morning, doing what she did every morning, when she noticed that the door to the study, Raymond's study, a room she had been gradually edged out of over the previous 3 years, was open, not fully open, just ajar, the kind of ajar that happens when a latch doesn't catch. She could see the edge of the desk, and on the edge of the desk, face up, was a document she had not been meant to see. She could see her name on it from where she was kneeling. She could see her signature, and she could see a date that could not be correct. Beyond the date printed on that document, she had been in a hospital bed. She did not move quickly. She did not reach for the document. She stood up from the floor, walked to the desk, and read the document from beginning to end, standing perfectly still. It was a transfer of general power of attorney over the primary estate. Holdings, signed in her name, dated the day after her surgery, notarized by Davis Croft. She placed the document back exactly as she had found it. She walked back to the hall. She picked up her scrubbing brush, and she continued scrubbing, because Eleanor Voss had been trained from childhood in the art of the long game. And she understood, in that moment with total clarity, that whatever she did next would determine whether she lost everything or reclaimed it. She was not going to be rushed. She was going to be right. What followed over the next 22 days was the most methodical private investigation conducted by a woman, acting entirely alone, that the Scottsdale legal community had ever encountered. According to the forensic accountants who would later review her work, Eleanor used a prepaid phone she had purchased in cash at a gas station 40 minutes from the estate. She photographed documents on nights when Raymond traveled. She contacted 2 former colleagues of her father's, men who were loyal to the Voss name, and who had been quietly concerned about Eleanor for years, but had no way through the walls Raymond had constructed around her access. And piece by piece, in the early hours of the morning when the house was dark and quiet, she assembled a picture of what had actually been happening to her family's fortune. 17 shell companies, 4 offshore jurisdictions, over $260 million, moved across a period of 6 years through a series of transactions that had been structured specifically to remain below the reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic regulatory review. And running through every one of those transactions, as either signatory, notary, or registered agent, was one name, Davis Croft, the man Raymond had brought in to replace Gerald Park, the man who had for 6 years, been not Eleanor's attorney but Raymond's accomplice. But here is the moment where the story stops being about Raymond Hale's greed and becomes something far larger and far colder. Because Davis Croft had not been recruited by Raymond, it was the other way around. The name that appeared as the ultimate beneficial owner of 3 of the 17 shell companies was not Raymond Hale. It was a man named Thomas Aldrich. A name that, if you had been paying attention to the very beginning of this story, you would have heard mentioned once, briefly, in the context of Eleanor's father. Thomas Aldrich had been Robert Voss's primary business rival throughout the 1990s. He had tried 3 times to acquire major Voss holdings and had been blocked each time, once by Robert personally, twice by Eleanor. He had publicly called Robert Voss, in a 2001 interview with a Phoenix Business Journal, the single greatest obstacle to his professional ambitions. Robert Voss had read that interview and reportedly laughed. He had not considered Aldrich a serious threat. That had been, it turned out, the one miscalculation of Robert Voss's professional life. Thomas Aldrich had begun watching Eleanor Voss approximately 14 months before the charity gala where she met Raymond Hale. He had identified her isolation following her father's death. He had identified Raymond, who moved in overlapping Phoenix business circles and who had, it would later emerge, significant gambling debts that Aldrich had quietly acquired. As a man who could be positioned and directed, Raymond Hale had not fallen in love with Eleanor Voss at a charity gala in the spring of 2004. He had been placed there. Every conversation, every patient evening at the kitchen table, every careful question about the permanence of land. All of it had been performance. The most sustained and intimate performance of a man who had been told that if he succeeded, his debts would disappear and his future would be secured. When Eleanor walked out of the estate for the last time in April 2012, she did not tell Raymond she was leaving. She did not confront him. She did not give him any signal at all that anything had changed. She simply drove to the office of an attorney in Tucson. A woman she had found through one of her father's former colleagues, someone with no connection to any part of her current life, and placed a 3-inch thick folder of photographed documents on the desk, and said, "Tell me what we can prove." It took 8 months. In those 8 months, federal investigators joined the case after Eleanor's attorneys identified the offshore components. Raymond Hale was arrested in December 2012. Davis Croft surrendered his law license 4 days later and entered into a cooperation agreement. Thomas Aldrich, who had believed himself sufficiently insulated by layers of corporate structure in Cayman Island registration, was indicted in February 2013 on 26 counts including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, financial elder abuse, and conspiracy to defraud. Eleanor recovered $211 million. Not all of it. Some had moved through jurisdictions where recovery was, as her attorneys put it, a multi-year endeavor that may never fully resolve. But the estate was never at risk. Because the one thing Raymond had not found, in all his years of careful movement through her life, was the document that Eleanor's father had insisted on filing in 1999, over the objections of his own attorneys, as what he called his final insurance policy, a family trust instrument registered in Arizona that placed the primary estate in a structure that required Eleanor's in-person biometric signature to transfer. Robert Voss, the son of a Tucson bricklayer, who had watched his father's dignity bent but never broken, had built a wall around his daughter's home that no forged document could breach. He just hadn't known at the time that she would ever need it. Eleanor Voss has never spoken publicly about what happened during those years. She has given no interviews. She returned to running the Voss portfolio with the same focused quietness she had always operated in. And the company has, in the years since, grown significantly. People who know her say she does not discuss Raymond Hale, she does not discuss Thomas Aldrich, and she does not, it has been noted by more than one person close to her, employ a cleaning service for the main hall of the estate. She does it herself, early in the morning, before anyone else is awake, not because she was told to, but because the floor of that hall is where she made the decision that saved everything her father built. And she has never wanted to forget what clarity feels like when you are low enough to the ground to finally see things clearly. Here is what I want to leave you with. This story is not, at its core, about money. The $1 billion is the canvas, but it is not the painting. The painting is about something more fundamental, the way a human being can be made, through patience and repetition, and the slow withdrawal of every outside perspective, to believe that the space they are confined to is the space they deserve. Eleanor Voss had every tool in the world to protect herself. She had intelligence, education, instinct, and resources. And none of it protected her from a man who understood that the most effective way to take something from someone is not to overpower them. It is to reshape, day by day, what they believe they are worth. The question I want to leave you with is not about Eleanor. It is about the people around her. The colleagues who noticed something was wrong and said nothing. The staff who watched the scrubbing begin and told themselves it was not their business. The world that looked at a woman on her knees and assumed she had chosen to be there. How many Eleanors are there right now? In houses you drive past, in families you think you know. And what would it take for someone to say, early enough, loudly enough, that this is not right? Was justice truly served when the man who built the trap walked away with a shorter sentence than the man he recruited to spring it? And what does it say about all of us? That the most dangerous thing in Eleanor's world was not the man who forged her signature. It was the years of silence that made the forgery possible. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, and I want to know what moment in this story hit you the hardest. And if you thought Thomas Aldrich was the coldest person in this story, wait until you hear what we have coming next. Thank you for watching. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you there.